All right, ready to dive in. Today we're going to tackle something super relevant, especially if you're prepping for those UPSC exams. We're talking writs in the Indian legal system. And get this, we've got a recent Supreme Court case, Shobha versus Muthoot Finance Ltd. from 2025. It really digs into when you can actually use these writs, especially when you're dealing with private companies. Pretty interesting, huh?
Yeah, this case goes way beyond just textbook definitions. It gets into this whole idea of public function and how that determines how far constitutional protections actually reach. Definitely something that could pop up in your prelims and your mains, so listen up.
Okay, so before we get all tangled up in legal jargon, let's just break it down. Imagine for a second your fundamental rights are being violated. What do? You need a powerful tool, right? Something that cuts through all the red tape and actually gets you justice. That's where these writs come in.
Exactly. Think of them as your direct line to the Supreme Court or high courts. They're basically demanding that your rights are upheld. Now, there are 5 types of writs, each one with a very specific purpose: Habeas Corpus, Mandamus, Prohibition, Certiorari, and then Quo Warranto. I know all those Latin terms can sound pretty intimidating, but they're really not that complicated once you understand the basics.
And luckily, our source material from TH breaks it down really nicely. They've got these super clear, concise definitions. So habeas corpus literally translates to have the body. It's basically used to challenge unlawful detention, someone's being held illegally. Then you've got mandamus, which means we command. Essentially, it's an order to a public official, making them do their legal duty.
And here's something interesting. Both the Supreme Court and the high courts can issue these writs, right? But their jurisdictions are a little bit different. The Supreme Court focuses mainly on fundamental rights violations. But the high courts, they've got broader powers. They cover other legal rights as well.
Okay, so we've got these powerful legal tools, the writs. But where do private companies fit into all of this?
Well, that's where this Shobha case gets super interesting. The Supreme Court basically made it clear. Just because a private company is regulated, let's say an NBFC, they're regulated by the RBI, doesn't mean they're automatically subject to these writs. They came up with this thing called the function test.
Exactly. It's not just about whether or not an entity is regulated. It's about whether it's performing a public function or duty, And in this case, the court decided that NBFCs, they mainly just deal with their account holders and borrowers, not the general public. So their core functions, they're seen as private in nature.
It's kind of think about a restaurant, right? They have to follow all these health codes, so they're regulated. But are they performing a public function? Not in the same way as, say, the electricity board. The electricity board, they provide an essential service to everyone, the whole community. Precisely. And that distinction is super important for understanding this whole idea of writ jurisdiction. It really emphasizes that checks and balances are there for public power, making sure there's accountability where it really matters.
All about keeping things in check, right? So this function test really highlights all the little details when it comes to writ jurisdiction, right?
Definitely.
It's not always a clear-cut black and white situation, especially with private entities and how they work with the government.
Absolutely. And this is the kind of stuff UPSC examiners love. They want to see if you can go beyond just memorizing definitions. Can you actually apply these concepts to real-life scenarios? That's the real test.
Exactly. So let's look closer at this Shobha case, see how it all played out. From what I got from our TH sources, the case was about a dispute between a customer and Muthoot Finance, a pretty well-known NBFC.
Right. The customer was trying to get a writ issued against Muthoot Finance. They claim the company violated their rights.
But the Supreme Court, they used this function test we talked about, and they ruled that the dispute was basically a private matter, stemming from a contract agreement between those two parties.
Yeah, so even though NBFCs are regulated by the RBI, their daily business, things like lending and recovery, those aren't considered public functions in this case.
So it's like drawing a line in the sand, right? On one side, you've got the state, the government, and all those different parts. That's where writs can be used to keep them accountable and protect people's fundamental rights. But on the other side, you've got private entities doing their own thing, engaging in contracts. Writ jurisdiction doesn't really apply there.
Exactly. It's about setting boundaries, But of course, it's not always that simple. There are situations where a private entity gets so entangled with the state that their actions could actually be seen as public in nature. That's when things get really interesting, especially for those prepping for UPSC.
Okay, so we've covered the function test, but there's another piece of the puzzle we got to unpack. Article 12 of the Indian Constitution. This article, it defines what the state actually means when it comes to fundamental rights and using these writs.
And this is where things can get a little tricky. Article 12 doesn't just say the state is the government, that's it. It casts a much wider net. It includes the central and state government, sure, but also local authorities, statutory corporations, even private entities. If they're acting on behalf of the state, they can be considered part of the state.
So it's not just about who's officially in charge,
Right.
but who's actually exercising public power, right?
Exactly. And if a private entity is basically doing the government's bidding, they could potentially be subject to these writs.
And there's a really important case, the Binney Ltd case from back in 2005.
Oh, yeah, that one's a landmark case.
The Supreme Court said that even a private company could be considered state under Article 12 if they were doing things that are usually associated with the government.
Right, those functions that we typically think of as the government's job.
That's super interesting. So let's say, just for example, there's a private company running a prison for the government. Would their actions be subject to writs in that situation?
Most likely, yeah. The court would really look at what exactly they're doing, how much control the government has over them, to decide if that private entity is essentially acting like an arm of the state.
So this idea of state under Article 12, it's not fixed, is it? It changes as society changes and as private companies get more involved in public services.
Exactly. It's dynamic, always evolving. And for UPSC aspirants, it's crucial to grasp those subtleties. Examiners don't want you to just spit out definitions. They want to see that you can handle complex legal questions, analyze different viewpoints. That's the key.
So going back to our 5 writs, would you say they all apply in the same way to everything that falls under state in Article 12?
That's a great question. And honestly, it depends. The basic principles are the same across the board, but how each specific writ is applied, that might change depending on what kind of entity we're dealing with. And the specific details of the case, it's all about context.
All right, let's take habeas corpus as an example. It's used to challenge unlawful detention, right? Someone's being held illegally. Would it apply the same way to a private company running a prison as it would to a government-run facility?
Ooh, that's a tough one. On the one hand, the right to personal liberty is super important, right? It shouldn't matter who's holding someone captive. That right should be protected. But on the other hand, there might be legitimate reasons for a private company to detain someone, like maybe for security reasons in a private prison. It's not always so straightforward.
So it really comes down to the nitty-gritty details of each case, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
The court would need to look at whether the detention was legal,
Right.
what were the reasons for it, and most importantly, does it violate someone's fundamental rights?
Exactly. That's where legal reasoning and analyzing cases come in. It's not just about blindly following the law. It's about understanding all the nuances and applying it fairly and thoughtfully.
This is where things get really exciting, isn't it? It's like solving a legal puzzle, putting all the pieces together, the writs, the function test, Article 12, to come up with a conclusion that makes sense.
Absolutely. And for those of you listening who are aiming for UPSC, this kind of analytical thinking is what will make you stand out. It's not enough to just know the law. You have to understand how to use it in real-life situations, just like judges do.
So if you're listening, pay attention to those details. Don't just try to memorize everything. Really try to grasp the underlying principles and how they all connect to each other. It's all about making those connections. And remember, our source material from TH is a fantastic resource if you want to dive deeper into all of this.
Oh yeah, TH is a great starting point. And don't be afraid to check out those landmark cases. They offer incredible insights into how legal interpretation has changed over time. And all the complexities of writ jurisdiction, it's like getting a glimpse into the minds of the judges who shaped our legal system. It's pretty fascinating.
It's like having a backstage pass to the legal world, right?
Yeah.
You get to see how everything unfolds and how the law adapts as times change.
Precisely. And for UPSC hopefuls, understanding that dynamic relationship between law and society is crucial. It's not just about passing an exam, it's about preparing for a career where you'll actually be applying these principles. Shaping policies, upholding justice, that's the big picture.
So as we finish this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. Don't just think of writs as some abstract legal concept. They are powerful tools. Tools for ensuring accountability, protecting people's fundamental rights, upholding the rule of law. And understanding how they work is essential, not just for those taking the UPSC exams, but for everyone who believes in a just and fair society. It's something we should all be aware of. It's pretty amazing, right, how these, I guess, kind of technical legal concepts, like these writs, can really impact our everyday lives. It just shows you the law isn't just some abstract idea up in the clouds. It's the foundation for a fair and just society. It's how we keep things running smoothly.
Absolutely. And understanding how these legal tools actually work, especially within the Indian Constitution. That's super important for anyone who wants to work in the civil services.
Right, because as future policymakers, administrators,
Yeah.
you'll be the ones responsible for upholding the law, making sure justice is served, and protecting everyone's rights.
Exactly. And this Shobha case, with that function test and how writs apply to private entities, it's a perfect example of how these legal principles are always being tested. And refined as society changes, it's a constant process.
It's like a reminder. The law is alive, it's always evolving, adapting to new challenges, new interpretations. And for those prepping for UPSC, it's a clear message. Just memorizing definitions won't cut it. You got to really understand those underlying principles
All right.
and be able to apply them critically. Think for yourself.
Couldn't agree more. The examiners want people who can think like lawyers.
Right. Problem solvers.
People who can analyze complex situations, weigh different perspectives, and then come to a solid, well-reasoned conclusion.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into writs, I really want to stress how important it is to stay curious about the legal world. Engage with it. Don't just treat it as exam material, cram it, and forget it.
Yeah, that's not the point. Read those judgments, follow what's happening in the legal system, have discussions about these things, share your thoughts. The more you immerse yourself in the world of law, the better prepared you'll be for those tough UPSC questions. And more importantly, to really serve as effective guardians of justice. That's the ultimate goal.
Well said. And remember, everyone, all of this great information comes from TH, your go-to resource for UPSC prep. Make sure to check out their stuff if you want to learn more.
And if you found this deep dive helpful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share it with your friends who are also studying for UPSC. Let's spread the legal knowledge and help each other build a just and equitable society. That's what it's all about.
That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in.